everybody, new faces and old. Dr. Bill Dickens will be speaking tonight about chaplaincy during the Civil War. And Larry just made a suggestion. We got some new faces here. Some I recognize, some I don't. And just say your name. We're going to start here and just say your name.
Leo Kristen.
I'm Lee's brother Jim.
I'm not Lee's brother, Ron.
I'm Derek.
Dan DiOrio.
Paul Dennis.
Tyler Brennan.
Joyce Williamson.
John Deering.
Andrew Lutz.
Ken Hoffman. Bob Jones.
Rick Smith.
Rick Smith's nephew, Ted.
Ralph Arnold.
Larry Hannigan.
Larry Hannigan.
Oh, yeah, Shirlene Jensen.
Okay. Bill brought some books here. You said 3.
Yeah.
These 2 are $3 a piece. The one that's about what he's going to talk about tonight is 18.
Yeah.
If you buy
all three, you want.
all 3 of them for $20. And he will sign them for you.
Yeah, if you want him.
Trust me, he knows how to write. He runs a school. So. You want to go ahead? Or?
I've run across some of those teachers you couldn't read the writing.
Joyce. The secretary at the school would say the same thing. She can't read my writing either.
Where are you? Where are you?
I am the administrator at Calvary Christian School
Oh,
in Covington, up off Taylor Mill.
yeah, I know where he is. I was the principal in Highlands.
Oh, okay. Okay. I am. I've got a wife and a 25-year-old son. I've been in the Air Force Reserve. I'll hit 19 years on June 10th. I'm a chaplain. I went in 1996. Last April, well, a year ago April, I was promoted to colonel. I'm assigned at Air Combat Command headquarters at Langley, well, Joint Base Langley, Eustis now. It used to be at Wright Pat. The view at Langley is much prettier. It's also much louder. That's where the F-22 is based right now, and there's a lot of them. It's funny when you hear them take off. All you hear are car alarms going off everywhere because they're very loud. I'm a graduate. I went to Georgetown. Somebody said, "Are you from Kentucky?" And I said, "Well, I came to college here and basically never left. I lived in Chicago, Illinois, and went to Georgetown College, just about 12 miles north of Lexington.
Go Tigers.
Met my wife, yeah. Met my wife and went back to Chicago for about 4.5 years for grad school, and then moved back to Kentucky. And so I've lived in Kentucky longer than I've lived anywhere else. I'm kind of if I've used the English language, I blame my early years in education. I did my first 4 years of elementary school in Mississippi. So you'll have to excuse me if I say the lights are on instead of on, and I may refer to you guys as y'all because we moved from South Haven, Mississippi to DeSoto, Texas, which is a suburb of Dallas. I've been stationed at Wright Pat, Carswell, which is now Naval Air Station, Joint Reserve Base, Fort Worth. Robins Air Force Base in Warner Robins, Georgia, and now at Langley. I did a master's degree at Southern Seminary in Louisville. Fell in love with church history while I was doing that, so I said, I think I'm going to do a THM, a Master's of Theology in Church History, and my thesis then was the history of the Northern Kentucky Baptist Association, and so I read a lot of extremely boring church and associational minutes, really tracking the baptisms during the Second Great Awakening and watching those things spike during the Second Great Awakening, even in Northern Kentucky. During the THM is when I entered the Air Force, and when I started looking at dissertation topics, I said, I think I want to write on the chaplaincy. When I was in 5th grade, there was a lawyer that went to our church in Texas, and he gave me a Civil War Times Illustrated magazine. Fell in love with the Civil War then, and so when I started looking at a dissertation topic, I said, I'm a chaplain. I love the Civil War, church history, chaplains, part of church history. So I decided I was going to write on the Civil War chaplaincy. Well, then, they send you to this research class at the beginning of your PhD, and I think they try to scare people out of it because there are about 100 of us in this room, and they say 2 of you are going to get teaching positions. So that right there, okay, if I want to be a college professor, I can rule that out now. But that class is to talk about research, and talk about writing, and talk about your dissertation. And so I had the idea, this is what I wanted to write on, but then they tell you, it has to be something original, or you have to refute something that's already been written. Well, I started thinking about, okay, I'm going to do something original. I narrowed it down to, I would really have to write on an individual then. I would have to pick a chaplain in the Civil War and write on that individual, and that really didn't float my boat. And so I started thinking about what can I refute, or what can I try to refute? And as I started doing the research, I started thinking about the history of the chaplaincy in the U.S., so beginning with the Revolution and looking, and so I thought, I said, really, the chaplaincy really becomes established, standardized during the Civil War. Well, so I began to do research on that. Now, I found several people that said the military chaplaincy became established with the National Defense Act of 1920, which is when the Chief of Chaplains was established and that type of thing. Well, as I began to look at that, I said, okay, I can see that argument. However, when you began to look at the role of a chaplain, the placement of a chaplain in units, even at least the initial rank of a chaplain, the establishment of a uniform, a particular uniform, the task that a chaplain would serve, who a chaplain reported to. Really, I think I believe there's a very clear picture that standardization occurred during the Civil War. And so the title of my dissertation was The Standardization of the Military Chaplaincy During the American Civil War. Now, the beautiful thing about defending a dissertation like that, when you go in and meet with your committee, you know right off the bat that you know more than they do about this subject. I knew when I walked in to defend my dissertation that the 3 guys sitting on the other side of the table knew nothing about this topic like I did. So it was a fairly comfortable defense. I've done some research on relatives. I think I was talking to a couple of you before. And my grandparents. One of my grandfathers was in World War II in the Korean War. He was a sonar man on a sub hunter. And I told the joke. I said the ship he was on was PC 1135. He said they called it the Little Stinker. And he said we applied, jokingly, he told me that we applied for submarine pay and air pay. He said because the ship was so small that when we crested a wave, we would go airborne, and when we came down, we would go under. And he said we never got that additional pay. However, his claim to fame was he was the sonar man who heard the deepest Japanese submarine that was sunk in World War II. Now, he claims that their ship sunk it, but there were 2 other destroyers and their ship involved in launching depth charges at this submarine. Their ship did paint a Japanese flag. They painted a Japanese flag on their ship to represent that submarine. He was in Tokyo Bay for the surrender of the Japanese, and following that surrender, he was being transferred to a larger ship to be sent home. Well, he decided he wanted that flag, and so he climbed up on the ship, and of course it's, how many of you are in the Navy? Anybody in the Navy? You know that there's just layers and layers and layers of paint slapped on these ships. Well, he got up there with his knife, and he cut that flag out. He got caught. The captain of the ship said, Pasley, you're going to repaint that flag before you get off the ship or you're not getting home. So he climbed there and repainted it. Well, he passed away about 6 months after I got home from Iraq in 2007, and I inherited that flag. I've got that little square of paint with that Japanese flag painted on it. And then I did some research and I found a photograph of, there's actually online, there's a community for PC guys who were on these PC craft, and there were 2 or 3 guys left alive who were on PC 1135. And so I contacted him and I said, do you have a photograph of the ship? And sure enough, he sent me a picture, a nice big picture of the ship. And I've had some pictures of my grandfather actually standing on the ship underneath that flag. So I've got all that framed in my office. So that was my mother's grandfather. My father's grandfather was an aircraft mechanic in the Army Air Corps. And then my wife's grandfather was stationed right here at Fort Thomas and was in the 740th Railway Operations Battalion in Europe. So I've always had a love for the military. Well, I began to do some research on Civil War roots and came across an interesting story. All I had was a name, Nacy Randall, and I knew he was in the Tennessee. It was in the Tennessee Cavalry Unit. And I knew what county he was from. So I started doing a little research and found out that he joined the Confederate Army after his brother had been killed. And found a little diary entry or letter that said he was going to take revenge on the Yankees who killed his brother. So it turned out he was in the 10th Tennessee Cavalry, fought under Joe Wheeler and Nathan Bedford Forrest. But I wanted to find out about his brother, my great uncle. Where did he die? Well, he was in the 42nd Tennessee. Well, the 42nd Tennessee was captured at Fort Donelson. So early in the war, he exits and is sent to a prison camp in Chicago, where Camp Douglas, where he died of pneumonia. And this is a stroke of luck, act of God that I found this out. I was at the Kent County Library and just trying to do some research, looking at the official records, and I see a book that says Confederate POWs who died in Union prison camps. I pulled it off the shelf. Didn't bother to look at the table of contents. I flipped the thing open, and it literally is just a list of names. And they're in alphabetical order, so I start looking, and sure enough, I find John C. Randall. 42nd Tennessee, died of pneumonia, buried in, I think it's Oak Hill Cemetery in a Confederate mound. Kind of comes full circle. Then I kind of close the book up and start looking again, and I just happened to open up to the Camp Douglas section. It was broken up by prison camps and then alphabetical order by prison camps, so I just happened to find opened up to the right prison camp and found his name. So that takes care of my dad's side of the family. Well, my grandfather, the one that was in the Navy, he talked about his great-grandfather who fought in the Civil War. And he swore up and down that he was Confederate. And both of my grandparents lived in Memphis, Tennessee, and their Southern blood ran, it was solid. Well, I started doing research on the Pasley side of the family, and I discovered that, and I had to tell, hey, Peepaw, guess what? He wasn't a Confederate. I said he was in the 41st Illinois. And to make things worse, the 41st Illinois was part of Grant's army that captured Fort Donelson. So our family's been bickering for over 100 years. So that's where I kind of fell in love. And so the two of those little books over there, Living in the Saddle and Roaming the South, are about the basically trace the history of the 41st Illinois and the 10th Tennessee Cavalry through the war. So to get to the Civil War chaplaincy, I'm going to take a step back to the Revolution. If you go back and you look at the American Revolution, you have chaplains who crop up in units in the Revolutionary War. However, it was their appointment was confusing. Often they were unofficial. For instance, the Connecticut governor chose the chaplains for Connecticut units. In Rhode Island, the brigade commanders chose the chaplains for Rhode Island units. In Virginia, the regimental officers chose their regimental chaplains. In New York and Pennsylvania, the chaplains were chosen by the state legislatures. In Massachusetts, the clergy organized the chaplaincy and rotated in and out of those units. And then in the Navy, the ship captain chose his chaplain. So often it was, if you wanted to be a chaplain, you looked for, okay, what state am I in? How do I need to go about this? I need to buddy up to the person who selects these chaplains. Now, before the war was over, Congress had taken over a little bit of this, and they had increased and decreased the number of assigned chaplains. They had increased and decreased their pay during the war. The responsibilities of a chaplain were very similar. They, as you can imagine, they conducted worship services, and often those worship services had multiple purposes. They wanted to control vice in the camp. Women are a stabilizing force in society. If you look at the early colonies, the colonies in New England, Plymouth, and they were established by families. They were much more stable. They had women there. If you look at Jamestown, they came for money and almost ceased to exist because there weren't that many women there. So you put a bunch of men in camps, and vice is going to occur. However you define vice, it was very clearly defined with profanity, drunkenness, gambling, all of those things. And so one of the reasons that chaplains were there and preached was to control the vice that were rampant in the camp. They were there to improve morale. When you think about combat, you think about war, people are facing life and death situations, and it is a calming factor, at least, to have somebody who will talk about the hereafter and will talk about God. That could be a calming factor to those who may be facing the end of their life and eternity in just a few minutes. Also, to keep morale up. In the Revolution, it was often in the case of, hey, we are fighting tyranny. You are here to free yourself from tyrannical rule. Patriotism often ran rampant through those early sermons, and attendance at worship services was often mandatory. Because hey, if this sermon is going to control vice, and it's going to improve morale, and it's going to promote patriotism, I want every one of my soldiers to attend. They were there to conduct funeral rites. They conducted the funerals of those that were killed. They cared for the sick and the wounded. They did personal counseling and interaction. Sometimes, just like today, when a soldier, a Marine, or an airman, or a sailor ships out, they are leaving behind wife, children, and in many cases concerns that are now going to be left to things that they took care of that now their spouse will have to take care of, and that creates a great amount of concern. When I was deployed, there were people who really had no concern for God or cared about that, but they wanted to talk to me. Hopefully I would give them wise advice. But another thing, and this is, you won't find this, and this is probably the big difference between the chaplaincy today and what you'll find in the chaplaincy in the Revolution and in the Civil War in particular, is that all chaplains, Protestant or Catholic, you'll find this among Catholic chaplains early on, is absolute confidentiality. Which means if someone comes and talks to me, I can't tell anybody. The President of the United States can't make me talk. The 4-star in charge of Air Combat Command can't make me talk. It's an absolute privilege that individual carries. Now, typically that comes from Catholic priests and the sanctity of the confessional that has now spilled over to all chaplains, whether they're Protestant, Jewish, Islamic, or Catholic. And so that personal counseling and interaction among people who may be struggling with either issues they're having right there or issues that may be at home was important. And then special services and remembrances. They often would hold dual positions. They may be a commissary officer. They may be an aide-de-camp for the commander as well. Some even shouldered arms. Now, you won't find that at all today, but some even shouldered arms. Now, between the Revolution and the Civil War, it was up and down. When the Mexican War broke out, they were really in trouble because they really didn't have chaplains. They didn't have military chaplains. They had civilian clergy contracted at posts. And so when soldiers shipped out, guess what? The civilian clergy said, "I'm not going. I'm going to stay back here. I'm not marching through Mexico with you." And so you really found a real struggle then with providing for those religious needs for the troops deployed. It was also during this time that you had a number of constitutional challenges to the existence of chaplains. When you think about the church-state separation clause, the fact that I'm just going to say this, the fact that the government pays me to perform religious duty flies in the face of the Establishment Clause. They, in fact, have established that. However, and there have been, about every 20, 25 years, there'll be someone who kind of mounts a crusade to get rid of military chaplains. And Congress has always said, and the Supreme Court has upheld this, the need for the U.S. military to be able to wage war supersedes that, and our need to provide for the religious needs of those troops we are sending to war supersedes any kind of establishment clause. Now, we have to tread lightly sometimes with what we say and what we do, and there are people that are constantly, I would say sometimes nitpicking. I've never run into a situation where I've been only once. Where I've had my hand slapped for something that I've said, or something I've written, actually. But we have to be wise with what we do. But Congress and the Supreme Court has supported the existence of chaplains. But it was these years between the Revolution and the Civil War, and in particular right around the Mexican War, that you begin to have these legal assaults on the existence of chaplains. Well, so when the war breaks out, when the Civil War breaks out, it was very obvious that there was an inadequate system in place for the mobilization of a large number of troops, and that this civilian post-chaplain thing was not going to work, especially with what was going to be a mobile army. Both sides understood that they weren't going to build walls and shoot each other in those walls. It was going to take a mobile army, and so. General Order 15 and 16, dated May 4th, 1861, established the need for 75,000 volunteers to quell the rebellion. And in these orders, a chaplain was required for every regiment. Initially, the chaplain was supposed to be selected by the regimental commander on the vote of the officers, but by the end of 1861, in the Union Army, chaplains were appointed by the president, and that's still the case today. When I received my commissioning, it was an appointment by the President of the United States. Now, I went in under Bill Clinton. I'm pretty sure Bill Clinton didn't look at my file. I am sure that that my name was on a long list of other names, and he was signing stuff, and it went across his desk. But the president is in charge of appointing chaplains. The chaplain was to be mustered in like a regular commissioned officer, and this was confusing because most within the military structure didn't see him as a commissioned officer. While he was commissioned like a regular officer, they did not see him as a commissioned officer. And this remained confusing, especially when Congress established the rank of chaplain. Rather than chaplain being your, in the Army, your MOS, or in the Air Force, your AFSC, they established the rank of chaplain, which has created more confusion among those in the Army. Most chaplains carried the rank of major, and at least one, Chaplain M.L. Haney of the 55th Illinois, and we'll talk a little more about him in a little while, he carried the rank of colonel. The regulation also required that he be an ordained minister in good standing with a Christian denomination. Now, I say Christian denomination because when the war first started, there were only going to be Christian chaplains, Catholic or Protestant. Now that's going to change during the Civil War with the addition of Jewish chaplains. His pay was to be that of a cavalry captain for whatever rank he held. If he held the rank of major, he was still going to get the pay of a cavalry captain. By the middle of 1862, things had already changed because Christian denomination was changed to religious denomination, which opened it up for Jewish chaplains. It also required endorsement by a religious organization. Chaplains, even today, are endorsed by a religious body. If, for some reason, you transgress the rules of your religious denomination and they pull your endorsement, that day your commission will be pulled. Chaplains cannot exist in the military without an endorsement, so if that endorsement is pulled, you lose your commission. So we have to keep two bosses happy. We have to keep our denomination happy. Well, we have to keep our wives happy. We have to keep our denomination happy, and we have to keep the military happy, which is sometimes a juggling act because 2 or 3 of those maybe are in disagreement most of the time as to what needs to be done. And so this endorsement becomes extremely important, and so denominations then begin to add the chaplain to, they may have pastors, they may have missionaries, and now they have chaplains also. The third thing is the mode of movement in the military changed from commissioning to an appointment. So they were no longer commissioned, they were appointed. Now, so Congress is establishing all this and trying to solidify all this. Then you come to uniform, which is a whole other issue. And if the slideshow worked, I would show you pictures of chaplains. And if you were to look to the center of this book, you'll see that there's a number of pictures of chaplains. The official uniform was initially started as a plain black frock coat with a standing collar, 1 row of 9 buttons, plain black pantaloons, black felt hat, and any Army forage cap without ornament. So it was a very, very plain uniform. Problem, Frederick Dennison of the 1st Rhode Island Cavalry said, "So far as outward appearance was concerned, it was sometimes difficult to distinguish a chaplain from sutlers or civilians. No reason exists why a chaplain in wartime should not be distinguishable by his dress like any other officer, nor why he should not be prepared to act upon the defensive." Father William Corby, the 88th New York, said one day he was referred to as a general, the next day he was asked to hold someone's horse. So he obviously had a problem with the uniform that he was issued as well. In 1864, regulations did amend that the above uniform, that there be herringbone braids put around the buttons and a wreath encircling a U.S. on the front of the hat or the forage cap. Now, like I said, if I could show you a slideshow, there are pictures of chaplains that some of them, they're right along this uniform description. Some of them look like staff officers, complete with swords and shoulder boards, epaulets. Most chaplains did their own thing, whatever they felt like doing. Confederates, it's a little different story. The Confederates were a little more reluctant to provide chaplains. In fact, the Union Army, there were about 3,000 chaplains that served the Union Army during the American Civil War. And the Confederacy, once again, and Confederate numbers range from here to here because all those records were kept in the state capitol. The first thing that the Union did when they captured the state was burn the state capitol to the ground. So records and numbers are sometimes skewed, but the most reliable numbers say that anywhere between 600 and 1,000 Confederates served as chaplains. Now, that does not mean that regiments went without a chaplain. Often there were informal chaplains. Hey, this is the preacher from our hometown. He's going to serve as our chaplain, but he's also, our sergeant. He's also a captain. He's also a private. Gardner Shattuck, who's done extensive study on religion in the Civil War, said Jefferson Davis and James Seaton were skeptical of the quality of clergy in the South, and felt that they would be more useful with a rifle than a Bible. So that there was that reason that the South was reluctant to assign chaplains to units. And then there was also a separation of church and state and a centralization issue. We know that governors in the South were reluctant sometimes to even send their troops to fight in another state. So to have the Confederate government tell your state that you have to have a chaplain assigned to your regiments, that wasn't going to sit well either. So this decentralization of power that was central to the Confederate cause also prohibited many units from having chaplains assigned to them. Chaplains were provided, if they had chaplains, they were appointed by the president with the input of the regimental commander. So you go back to how things were done in the North, but here you have the input of the president. But hey, because of those fierce state rights, the regimental commander is also going to have some say with this. Their commissions expired when the war ended because the Confederacy had no intention of a large standing army when the war was over. So there was no need. If there's no large standing army, there's no need for chaplains. So when the war's over, your commission expires. Initially, they were to make $85 a month. 2 weeks later, after that was 2 weeks later, this was amended to $50 a month, and then $50 a month plus the rations of a private. By 1862, though, the salary had raised to $80 a month, and that's $80 of Confederate money, which in small print says will be paid in gold when the war is over. So they would be papering their walls with it a little later, stuffing their mattress with it. Confederate uniforms, there was no specified chaplain uniform in the Confederacy. In general, chaplains of the Army and the Army of Tennessee wore a gray frock coat with staff buttons, and the color on the collar they wore either Maltese cross or a Bible pendant. And in general, chaplains in the Army of Northern Virginia wore the uniform of their regiment with an embroidered cross or a C on the collar, representing a chaplain or the Christian cross. Today, I have a cross on my uniform. A Jewish chaplain has tablets on his uniform. A Buddhist chaplain has the Buddhist prayer wheel. An Islamic chaplain has the crescent moon. You have chaplains like Robert Dabney, who actually also served as Stonewall Jackson's chief of staff. You have one that I really wish I could show you a picture is Chaplain Babbage, and he's the picture of him. He's sitting with his arms crossed. He's in a gray frock coat, and I don't know how long it took to take the picture, but he's very obviously asleep. He's got his head down like this and his eyes closed, and he's wearing a Revolutionary War era tri-corner hat. Jesuit. Now you have Frederick Dennison, the 1st Rhode Island Cavalry, says there's no reason why a chaplain should not wear a military uniform. Well, the Jesuit Pierre Louis Hippolyte Gash of the 10th Louisiana Volunteer Infantry, on seeing 2 Jesuit chaplains wearing military-style uniforms, he said, "I regard it only natural that Protestant ministers should disguise themselves in such a get-up, but that 2 Jesuits should do it, well, I have a hard time believing it, much less approving of it." And so you may have had the opposite opinion by some chaplains in the Confederacy over the use of military uniforms. The task of chaplains, once again, provide religious services, could be powerful due to the role of speech, even in entertainment. Nowadays, the fact that you're here to listen to somebody talk is an anomaly. Most people are going to be sitting in front of a TV, or they'll be at some venue watching entertainment or playing a game of some sort. The role of speech in entertainment made the role of worship services that much more significant because people had the patience to sit down and listen to someone talk. Location and time was often frustrating because, battles were not fought Monday through Friday. They were often fought on Sunday. They were often fought early in the morning. Early in the morning on Sunday, let's just face it, that's the preacher's prime time. And often, armies were on the move, and so the idea of an established building where we would worship was often difficult to come by. Now, as the war progressed, especially that last year up in Virginia where the lines become more stabilized, you really have some pretty significant looking chapels being built by men to worship in. But often the time was frustrating as well as the location. Colonel St. Clair Mulholland, who was commander of the Irish Brigade, comments on Father William Corby at Gettysburg, the famous, if you watch the movie Gettysburg, he has a cameo, you get his back in the movie Gettysburg. He has to my knowledge, it's the only Civil War statue to a chaplain, is at the Gettysburg. It says the brigade stood in column of regiments closed in mass. As a large majority of its members were Catholics, the chaplain of the brigade, Reverend William Corby, proposed to give a general absolution to all the men before going into the fight. Father Corby stood on a large rock in front of the brigade, addressing the men. He explained what he was about to do, saying that each one could receive the benefit of absolution by making a sincere act of contrition and firmly resolving to embrace the first opportunity of confessing his sins, urging them to do their duty, and reminding them of the high and sacred nature of their trust as soldiers and the noble object for which they fought. The brigade was standing in order arms. As he closed his address, every man, Catholic and non-Catholic, fell on his knees with his head bowed down. Then stretching his right hand toward the brigade, Father Corby pronounced the words of absolution. Mulholland went on to say that the background sound to the service was the battle raging in the peach orchard on a little round top. And so the idea of the peaceful chapel setting is often not the case in the Civil War. Despite the difficulties, and like I said, those difficulties were location, time, and sometimes commanders. We know that there were some commanders that really appreciated chaplains, and then we know there were some that thought they were a waste of rations. So sometimes chaplains had to deal with those as well. Most chaplains were able to adapt to that situation and did quite a good job and remained encouraged even in themselves. Messages range from purely religious in nature to a mixture of religious and patriotic. All had as their goal preparing these soldiers for what would come in battle. And that might be their own death. That might be the killing of someone else. That might be the fear that strikes the human heart when you realize there are people that are trying to kill you. And most, on both sides, saw their cause as holy. Whether it was the destruction of slavery, the preservation of the Union, the preservation of states' rights, or the rebellion of the expulsion of the invader, their cause was a holy cause, and chaplains would grasp onto that in their sermons. Both armies experienced periods of revival. Confederate revivals were typically larger and more widespread, and there's more written about, there's more first-hand writing about the Confederate revivals. Christ in the Camp by John Jones is about this thick, talking about the revivals in the Army. There's William Bennett's A Narrative of the Great Revival, which prevailed in the Southern armies during the late Civil War. Both of those talk about the number of people who were converted. Now, I'm going to use the phrase ministerial example, over-exaggeration for the sake of emphasis. Some of the numbers that these guys purport of people who were converted may be a little embellished. Bennett says that in the Confederate armies there were 150,000 soldiers converted during these revivals. Now, once again, when we think about Confederate numbers, you say how many Confederate soldiers were there? Well, probably the best numbers are between 750,000 and 1 million served at one time. So you're saying that during these revivals, possibly 1 in 5 were converted. And then when you factor the fact that there were probably some already converted who didn't need conversion when these revivals occur, it's hard sometimes to think that might be an accurate number. However, We also know that these revivals are occurring in late 1862 and in mid-1863 and 1864. These soldiers have seen a lot. They've seen more than young men should have to see, and the gruesome nature of wounds and war at that time. And it's possible that it's possible that a wide number of them would turn to God for solace, having seen what they'd seen, and possibly having to have done what they did. Charles Wilson Reagan, who wrote "Baptized in Blood: The Religion of the Lost Cause," he has a chapter in that book. He talks about, if you know anything about the Lost Cause, after the war, you know that Robert E. Lee kind of becomes the patron saint. Longstreet is kind of the Longstreet Pickett. Those guys who criticized Lee become the goats. It takes on almost a religious fervor that the South really, they were fighting a losing battle the whole time, and that the only reason they lost, it wasn't due to being outgeneraled. It wasn't due to being outfought. It was simply that the North had more men and material to throw at us. Now, Grant would come back later and say, I disagree wholeheartedly with that, and he would point to decisions made in the Overland Campaign of 1864 that said absolutely those led to the defeat of Robert E. Lee and ultimately the Confederacy. Longstreet becomes the goat in the religion of the lost cause because, guess what? I'm kind of going to support Grant and the Republican. Longstreet becomes a Republican, which was a no-no for high-ranking Confederates, and then he supports Grant in his presidential election, which was another no-no. Well, Charles Wilson Reagan, who writes this book, Baptized in Blood, he says that John William Jones, the guy who wrote Christ in the Camp, the chapter is the preacher of the lost cause. That these stories of these revivals that take place and large numbers of people being converted to Christianity just add fuel to this sacred cause that was, albeit a losing cause, that the South was fighting for. And so there were large revivals, and their revivals took place in the Union Army as well. However, they're not, oddly enough, they're not as well documented. Like I said, there are volumes written by Confederate chaplains on these revivals that take place. You have colloquial references to revivals that take place in the Union Army. You don't have these large volumes like you do in the South. Hospital work. You know from your study of the Civil War that most men who were wounded would rather lie on the battlefield and die than be taken to the hospital because they'd heard the horror stories. They'd seen they'd walked past hospitals and seen piles of body parts laying out there, and they'd heard the groans of men who were laying out in the sun and being untreated. And so the idea of going to the hospital was the worst thing in the world to them. And so much of the work that chaplains did was centered around the hospital. And in fact, when their place in battle, when the battle would begin, the chaplain was supposed to report to the hospital. Now, they didn't always do that, but that was when you look at the order of battle, just like the musicians are sent to the rear as stretcher bearers, the chaplain is sent to the hospital to be ready to receive the wounded. Unit visitation was an important thing. The chaplain making his rounds, if you will, just talking to people. And in all reality, that has become the hallmark of the chaplaincy today, and it's becoming even a larger part as the Department of Defense budgets get tight. They're starting to close chapels down. They're closing chapels on bases to save money because they go onto these bases. Well, I'll tell you, I went to the Good Friday service at Langley, and there were 4 people in uniform. The rest of the people were retirees. Now, trust me, I have no problem with retirees. They provided the freedom that we enjoy today. They provided that. But the Department of Defense doesn't want to spend their money supporting retirees when they can go to churches in and around the base. And so, in many cases, the military today is transitioning from a chapel-based chaplain to I guess you call it an industrial model, where the chaplain might have an office, but he spends his time not preparing sermons to preach on Sunday morning, but out visiting and talking to and interacting with his troops and his airmen, his Marines, and his sailors. And so unit visitation, even in the Civil War, was extremely important. Henry Clay Trumbull, who was the chaplain for the 10th Connecticut, felt that informal visitation to him was just as important for teaching his troops to live a good life as the sermons that he preached on Sunday. And just a little story. My first trip overseas, and typically when I would fly with my unit, they would put me in the cockpit. So for me, that's an interesting view. I'm sitting up there and they've got me on headset, and we'll just say sometimes air crew, their language is a little salty. And I'm sitting up in the cockpit, and I've got the headset on, and it's on hot mic, so anybody can talk. And the loadmaster in the back is a C-141. The loadmaster in the back just lets loose with a string of profanity. Now, and it was a female about this tall. Well, dead silence over the intercom, and then she says, "Is the chaplain on hot mic?" And the aircraft commander says, "Yep." So I didn't say anything. We landed in Germany. It was an air medical evacuation, so we were there a couple days, and we were bringing some folks back. And we get on the airplane, and we're getting ready to land at Andrews, and this same loadmaster, you hear this kind of deep, and she comes over the hot mic and says, "Chaplain, I'm sorry." So it's interesting because you wear that crosswind uniform, and maybe even people who have no religious affiliation, they see that as and this is what the military says, you represent the holy. And so even though it might not change their behavior right then, they recognize that. And so that's what Trumbull was getting at. Me being out with the troops did as much to help them live a good life as what I might preach on Sunday morning. The chaplain's place of battle, like I said, officially they were stationed at the regimental hospital. However, some did go to the front. Union Chaplain J. Chandler Gregg said, "My business was to cheer the faint, to succor the weary and wounded, and to minister to the wants of those dying on the cold ground or in our temporary hospitals far from friends and home." A captain in the 10th Connecticut, referring back to Trumbull, said, "We count our chaplain as good as 100 men in a fight because the men fight so much better when he is with them." There were 4 chaplains who won Medals of Honor during the Civil War. John Whitehead of the 15th Indiana Infantry at Stones River was awarded the Medal of Honor for going to the front and aiding wounded in the midst of combat. Francis Hall of the 16th New York Infantry at Salem Heights in Virginia on May 3rd of 1863 exposed himself to fire. That's what officially written in the award. Exposed himself to fire in order to aid wounded. James Hill of the 21st Iowa Infantry at Champion Hill in Mississippi in May also of 1963 actually captured 3 enemy pickets. And then I mentioned M.L. Haney earlier. He served as a chaplain for the 55th Illinois Volunteer Infantry. He was elected the colonel of the regiment. After bravery he showed at Vicksburg and Chattanooga, he turned over command. He kept the rank, turned over command of the regiment to the lieutenant colonel. And at the Battle of Atlanta, Haney rallied the troops, which led to a counterattack which broke the Confederate line. And what Haney says is, "As I turned after firing, it was said by a cool-headed sergeant who was looking on that 100 muskets were fired at my person." Now, that sounds strikingly like the George Washington story. 100 muskets were fired at my person. It may have been less, but the brush was mowed to the left and right by rebel bullets, and by a miracle my life was preserved. In 1896, Haney was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for his actions. So, by exposing themselves, there were many chaplains who were killed and captured. Now, when it comes to being captured, both sides officially said that chaplains would not serve as prisoners of war. The Confederates in Article 46 in 1860, both of them dated 1862, all chaplains taken prisoner of war by the armies of the Confederate States will, while in the discharge of their duties, will be immediately and unconditionally released. Now, if they were commanding troops, if they were returning fire, they were going to be treated like anybody else. But if they were discharging their duties as chaplain, ministering and aiding those who were wounded, encouraging those, they would be immediately and unconditionally released. So they weren't part of an exchange program or anything else. And Article 90 on the Union side in 1862 said the principle being recognized that chaplains should not be held as prisoners of war, it is hereby ordered that all chaplains so held by the United States shall be immediately and unconditionally discharged. So there were Confederate chaplains possibly being held prior to this, and they were to be immediately released. They were not subject to the cumbersome parole and exchange process the way other troops were. In 1863, Article 100 in the Union regs did state that they would be allowed if they chose, let's say their unit was captured, if they chose to remain a prisoner of war, they could. The Geneva Conference of 1864, which is the precursor of the modern-day Geneva Convention, stated that that chaplains were not to be held as prisoners of war. They were to be detained personnel, and that's what it's stated today. That if we are captured, we're not to be prisoners of war. We're to be detained, which creates in and of itself an issue for chaplains. If I'm a detained person, it doesn't mean that they set me free. I'm still detained, but I'm allowed, according to the Geneva Conventions, I'm allowed to go about and minister to and take care of those folks that are POWs around me. Now, the Code of Conduct for POWs says that I will try to escape. Now, by stating that chaplains are detained personnel, that does not give us the right to try to escape. So it does put chaplains in a precarious situation if you were to be captured. Nowadays, let's face it, if we're captured by our enemies today, you're probably going to be beheaded. You know, the simple fact you wear a cross in the uniform makes you, a bad guy to begin with. So, Geneva Convention works if we go to war with Mexico or Canada or England, which probably is not going to happen. But it does create a problem for chaplains. But this all started back in the 1860s with the Geneva Conference that said chaplains were not going to be combatants. They were supposed to be detained. Some, however, did fall through the cracks. At least 2 Confederate chaplains were sent to Johnson's Island because they induced a couple of their captors to desert. In other words, they were such convincing chaplains that they convinced their Union captors to desert the army. Well, they were sent to Johnson's Island because that's not going to go over. One Union chaplain was held at Macon, Georgia, ended a prayer asking God, because he ended a prayer asking God to bless Abraham Lincoln. When corrected by the prison commander, he had a great debate over the commander's right to police his prayers. The prison commander withdrew the order for him not to pray for, withdrew his order forbidding him to pray for the president. Chaplain J. Harvey of the 110th Ohio Volunteers was kept in prison because of his wife. Evidently, his wife had transported a slave girl from Virginia to Ohio illegally. So the chaplain was detained because of what his wife had done. I.T. Tishner, who was the chaplain for the 17th Alabama, killed a colonel, a captain, and 4 privates with his fine rifle at the Battle of Shiloh. Telfar Hodgson, who was chaplain for the 1st Alabama Cavalry, was referred to as the Fighting Parson. Frederick Dennison, 1st Rhode Island Cavalry, we talked about him earlier, who said that it's appropriate for chaplains to wear a military uniform. He wore a captain's uniform and actually captured 6 of Stonewall Jackson's foot cavalry. James Spellman of the 5th North Carolina Infantry led several assaults at First Bull Run and impressed James Longstreet so much that he was awarded a captured sword and asked to join Longstreet's staff. So when it comes to combat, while they were all supposed to go to the regimental hospital, it's very obvious that not all of them went to the regimental hospital. Another one of their responsibilities was to improve morality. Swearing, gambling, drunkenness, and lack of self-control were frowned upon by most commanders, maybe not General Hooker, but most of the rest of them, they were frowned upon that, and so the chaplain was used to improve morality there. And some of the impacts that these chaplains had on their troops, suffering with the troops, good chaplains carried the same burdens as their troops. And probably another chaplain that gets a little bit of a cameo in a movie, Father Peter Wellen. How many of you have seen the movie Andersonville? Oh, it's a good movie. I was in it. I spent a week in Sonoya, Georgia as a Union POW.
You mean the Ted Turner?
Yes, the Ted Turner Andersonville. If you watch the scene where they hang the 6 raiders, you'll see a Catholic priest who's walking behind them. That's Father Peter Wellen. He was initially with the Montgomery Guards at Fort Pulaski. When he was captured, the officers were sent to Johnson's Island. Wellen went with the enlisted folks to Fort Delaware on the Delaware River to wait to be exchanged. When he returned to Georgia, he went back to his post at the Catholic Church in Savannah. He was also assigned to visit the Confederate military posts in Georgia. One of those military posts was Andersonville Prison. He started his visits there in 1864. He ended up spending a majority of his time not with the Confederate guards, but with the Union prisoners inside the fence. He subjected himself to the same disease that those guys experienced. He spent from 9 o'clock in the morning to sundown in the stockade ministering to these POWs. One of the Union POWs in a letter after the war said, "By coming here, he exposed himself to great danger of infection, kneeling down by the side of decaying bodies in the stench and filth of the gangrene wards. Many and many a time I have seen him thus praying. His services were sought by all, for in his kind and sympathizing looks, his meek but earnest appearance, the despairing prisoners read that all humanity had not forsaken mankind." Wellen died in 1861 of lung congestion that he had contracted while inside the stockade at Andersonville. Chaplain Charles McCabe, who was chaplain for the 122nd Ohio Volunteer Infantry out of Zanesville. He was captured at Winchester, Virginia. When his regiment left him and the surgeons, they were left behind to care for the wounded. After being given 50 men by Confederate General Gordon to take care of the dead and wounded, he was shipped on to Libby Prison. While there, he taught his fellow POWs the battle hymn of the Republic. He contracted typhoid fever and was sent to the prison hospital. He survived and was exchanged in October of 1863. He was too physically debilitated to return to the 122nd. He became a fundraiser for the U.S. Christian Commission, the USCC, traveling and speaking about his time in Libby Prison. Chaplains were also in charge of education. We've got to remember nowadays, everybody has to go to school. We know that there was a significant percentage of the Union Army and a larger percentage of the Confederate Army who were uneducated. Well, education, writing, teaching to read, arithmetic, science, it was the responsibility of the chaplain often to do that teaching, because one of the most educated guys in your regiment was probably going to be your chaplain, especially in the North, because they probably had an undergraduate degree and probably had a seminary degree as well. Some of the miscellaneous things, prayer before going into battle. Interesting story, Chaplain Hartsock of the 132nd Pennsylvania actually he got himself into a little bit of trouble. On November 25th, 1862, Captain Damari received a letter stating that his boy was not expected to live. He tried to get furlough but failed. and then concluded to take a French furlough, go AWOL, and the chaplain took him to a Key Landing to get him on a boat and get him out of there. So the chaplain aided his him going AWOL. They often help their troops get paid. You know, sometimes the pay system today is pretty. It's in good shape now. You know, when I do my duty, I get paid pretty quickly afterwards. Well, you know, the pay system was not as squared away as it was then, and sometimes chaplains would go to bat for their troops to make sure that they did get paid. And they contacted families. Chaplain James Rogers, who was a Union chaplain, stated that of all the things he did, that was the most taxing thing, to contact a family and talk about the death of their loved one. When I was in Iraq in 2007, we had roadside bomb went off, and they brought in a Navy EOD, Chief Petty Officer, who was in bad shape. He ended up our FOB. Our goal was to stabilize them and get them on a medevac to Balad, where they would be stabilized further and put on a C-17 to Ramstein, Germany. This Chief Petty Officer, he died in our emergency room, and I thought my responsibility was I was assigned to the emergency room, and I thought my responsibility would be to talk to the doctors. They would always, anytime they lost a soldier in combat, they would go through what they called a hot wash, and they would say, okay, from the time the individual arrived at our hospital, what did we do? What could we have done better? Did we do anything wrong? Did we play a role in the loss of this individual? And I would always go to those hot washes, and I would be there to encourage them and say, look, I was there, you did everything that you could do, you worked hard, you worked fast. You know, when there's 32 holes in an individual, it's hard to stop the bleeding. And so that, I thought that would be my responsibility. Well, about 2 days later, I got an email and said, hey, there was a young man from Covington, Latin, that was killed up near you. Well, the Chief Petty Officer that was killed was Gregory Billeter. And so I was coming home about a month after he was killed. I was coming home, and I got home, and it just weighed on me. And so I called my mom, and I said, I'm just going to ask a question. I said, had something happened to me, and somebody that lived close to you was there when it happened, would you want to be contacted by them? And she said, yes, absolutely. And so I got on the phone, and I will say this was the toughest phone call I have ever made. I mean, I'm a school administrator, so I've called parents and said, I'm expelling your kid. I've called parents and said, your kid's not getting in our school. I've made some, what I feel are some tough phone calls. And I got on the phone, and his mom answered the phone. And I said, Mrs. Bilter, my name is Bill Dickens, and I'm an Air Force chaplain. And I don't know how to tell you this, but I was in the emergency room when your son died. And, immediate wailing begins. Well, then, I hear her husband jump up and said, who is this? And I explained it to him, and I explained, what I was doing, and I wanted to assure they were Roman Catholic, and I said, I want to assure you that there was a Catholic priest there with your son when he passed, when his life ended. I want you to know that there was a Catholic priest there to give him last rites and extreme unction and those things that are necessary, and I would like to meet you. And so we actually set a dinner date, and I got to meet her. And I can agree with James Rogers here that was the most taxing thing that I have ever done in my 52 years of life. Another thing that chaplains would do is they would serve as the librarian, the postmaster, any other job that no one wanted or that no one could do, the chaplain would do.
Grave digger?
Grave digger, whatever was necessary. I mean, they would often dig the grave and then perform the funeral. There were some firsts in the Civil War. The first female chaplain was in the Civil War. Ella Hobart. She was the first Wisconsin heavy artillery from 1864 to 1865. The regiment voted for her to be chaplain. Her election was sent to the regimental commander, who sent it on to the governor of Wisconsin. Instead of commissioning her because they didn't know what to do, the governor of Wisconsin forwarded it to the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton. Stanton refused to give her a commission. Hobart even maintained an endorsement letter from President Lincoln that didn't sway Stanton. The officers of the regiment refused to elect another chaplain, so Hobart served without official capacity and without pay at her own expense for the rest of the war. In 1869, a congressional act got her pay that she deserved. And then it was an act of Congress on January 14th of 1892 that righted the situation completely. And they took the original act that gave her pay and added her to the muster of the regiment as the chaplain. That was a posthumous act. She never lived to see that happen. You also had a number of black chaplains that served during the Civil War. Most USCT regiments and those black regiments supplied by the states had white chaplains because they had white officers. And because the chaplain was considered an officer, they had white chaplains. And this was due to the misguided belief that blacks couldn't serve as officers, and the same way was true with chaplains, as well as white officers. Because the chaplain was an officer, the white officers in those regiments didn't want to share their mess with a black chaplain, and so most of them had white chaplains. There were, however, 14 black chaplains that served in the Union Army. None were killed, and one died of disease. And in December of 1987, there was an article in Civil War History magazine by Edwin Redkey, and he makes an interesting statement. He says, "Until Reconstruction, no African American achieved higher official public status than that of a black Army chaplain." And so when you think about, in Reconstruction, we know that we had that there were African Americans that would go and serve in Congress, that would serve in the Senate, that would serve as governors of states, that would certainly serve as mayors and lesser politicians. But prior to Reconstruction, when you think about it, okay, this person is serving as a chaplain, which is an officer rank in the United States Army. You're right, there probably wasn't a higher official status that a black individual would serve in. There were also Jewish chaplains. Like I said, that when they changed from Christian denomination to religious denomination, you also had Jewish chaplain. And in the slideshow that you obviously didn't get to see, I have a picture of the Jewish chaplain. If I can find him here. This way. Let's see. Chaplain Jacob Frankel, first Jewish chaplain. So I go back to my dissertation argument, and when I look at the story of the military chaplaincy during the Civil War, I believe an argument can be painted that the standardization of the chaplaincy, there was no chief of chaplains, but the role of the chaplain in the regiment, the responsibilities of the chaplain, the pay of a chaplain, the uniform of a chaplain, what are the chaplain's responsibilities, were all established during the Civil War. And so, following the Civil War, when the National Defense Act comes in, they've got the model in place. They just have to codify it and provide a chief of chaplains and a rank promotion structure, which they didn't really have. And you've got you've got the chaplaincy. So I do believe the standardization of military chaplaincy occurred during the Civil War. So, like I said, if you'd like a copy of this is my dissertation rewritten in book form. If you'd like to get a copy of that, it's $19.95 on Amazon, and I sell about 15 copies a year. It is not a bestseller on Amazon, but I get royalty checks for about $35, which my wife and I can go out to eat once a year on that. If you'd like to purchase this, it's $18. If you want to purchase one of the little booklet on the 41st Illinois or the 10th Tennessee Cavalry, those are $3 each. If you want to buy all three, $20. You can take them all three with you. That's completely up to you, though.
Very good.
I want to thank you for having me.
There was just a chaplain that was awarded the Medal of Honor. That was a chaplain in the that was captured by the North Koreans, and they just awarded him a Medal of Honor not too long ago.
Yeah, there have been a number of chaplains after the Civil War who have, and most of them were awarded it because of their proximity with units that were heavily engaged or captured. And we've had two chaplains die in Iraq and Afghanistan, one in Iraq and one in Afghanistan. The one in Afghanistan was wounded and died of his wounds. About 2 years later, the one in Iraq was killed by a roadside bomb when the convoy that he was actually in a convoy to go out to visit the different units that he was associated with, and his convoy hit a roadside bomb and he was killed instantly.
I was in the Moody Museum a few years ago, and I know Moody had some connection with the Civil War, but was he not a chaplain?
D.L. Moody, I believe he was associated with the U.S. Christian Commission. There were a number of that were called colporteurs that distributed tracts, and there were thousands of tracts that were distributed and given out. And I believe that's what D.L. Moody was associated with. Now, I know that James Pettigrew Boyce and Broadus, the two of the three founders of Southern Seminary in Louisville, were both Confederate. At the time, Southern Seminary was located in Greenville, South Carolina, and both of those individuals served as Confederate chaplains. And if you go to Southern Seminary, you go up the third floor of the library, and they've got all these class pictures, and you begin to look at the early professors there, and most of them were Confederate chaplains. Baptists provided a lot of chaplains in the South.
Did General Polk do any chaplain work? I know he was an Episcopalian minister. He didn't do any chaplain.
He didn't really do any chaplain work. I would probably say that Oliver O. Howard did more, as a general, did more Christian service than Leonidas Polk did.